I finished a whole mitten. And it's perfect, and it's lovely, and it's fine. And then I started the second mitten, and I got all the way to the end of the fingertips, and I managed to drop the whole thing off the bed. I think this project is cursed. I made my grandma a pair of mittens for her 80th birthday a few years ago, but she has since lost one, so I'm gonna make her a new pair this year. Grandma, if you're watching this, stop. At least wait until after I've given you the mittens. Last time I modified a glove pattern from another online pattern generator and it wasn't quite what I wanted, so this time I'm going to draft my own pattern. Grandma wants these to be warm, so I'm working with a few colors of this Wool Ease wool blend. And I want to knit these Fair Isle because Fair Isle gives the fabric a little more bulk. That means I'll have to knit these flat because you can't knit Fair Isle in the round on the knitting machine. And the pattern will have to reflect that. I'm excited for this because I'm not just drafting one pattern, I'm drafting a pattern generator. I feel the need to prove to y'all that working with abstractions is actually easier than working with real numbers. So let me show you how I do this. So we are going to draft a mitten pattern. So, mitten needs to fit over your hand. So that is what it's going to look like roughly when it's done. And then we will have some amount of cuff and ribbing down here. So I want to knit this flat. So I'm going to turn it out and mirror it. And it'll look something more like, see, we have a rectangle of ribbing here. Then we get to the wrist and it's going to increase out. And then we're going to do some bind off for the thumb. And then we are going to knit up. And then there will be some shaping up here that we will get to. But this is the center line. So this line here is essentially the left edge of my hand. I want 2 inches of ribbing. And that's the only number we're going to have in this entire thing. And then this distance here is going to be wrist circumference. And then this distance here is going to be hand circumference. So the way that these mittens are usually knit, you knit the cuff up to the wrist, and then you increase along the thumb side until you get to where the thumb joins the hand, and then take these stitches off on waist yarn and keep knitting the hand up and then do the shaping for the top, and then come back later and pick up these live stitches from the thumb to knit the thumb later. What I would like to figure out is this distance, this whole distance here, because it's going to be the hand circumference plus the thumb circumference. And like, I don't want to force people to take measurements like this because they'll be kind of a pain. So what if I can do this in terms of percentages? So I have fairly large hands. I don't know if they're proportional to anybody else's hands, but I'm going to assume that human hands are fairly standard proportions because that has served me well in the past. So if my hand circumference is, let's say, 8 inches, and then my thumb circumference is going to be, I don't know, 2.5. So what's 2.5 over 8? Calculator time. 2.5 divided by 8 is 0.3. So let's say we want to have a little ease in the thumb. So we could call this just 30% of hand circumference and work with that there. That's not the end of the world. And then the distance from the cuff to the thumb, to the top of the thumb, is something else I'd like to figure out. So one of the measurements I know I'm going to need is the distance from the bottom of your hand to the tip of your fingers. So for me, that's going to be, we'll call that 7 inches. Now we'll call that 7.5 inches. So then the distance from the bottom of my hand to where my thumb splits off is about, I don't know, let's call it 2.5. Which incidentally is also the circumference of my thumb. I wonder if I could use that instead. That would make sense, because then it's doubled and then that's roughly the shape of your hand. Okay, so let's call that circumference of thumb. So that's going to be 30% of hand circumference. And then this distance here is just going to be wrist to fingertip. Okay, that is doable. And then because I'm knitting this flat, the tip of the hand shaping will be tricky because either I can, let me redraw this. So either it's going to be wrist, thumb, hand, and this is split here, and then I shape each half of this individually. Or what I can do is wrist, hand, up this way, and this is where it splits. Or I can have this just be live stitches, and then do one half the way that a commercial sock is shaped with short rows. So it'll be short rowed in, and then short rowed back out, and then this is live stitches, and it gets folded over and joined here. I'm tempted to go this way, but I'm a bit concerned that because I want to do this Fair Isle, it'll be hard to short row and Fair Isle at the same time. But it should be totally doable. I just need to figure out where the shaping starts and then draft that into the pattern. And the shaping is going to depend on how pointed I want this to be. I looked at some examples of knit mittens online and they like come to more of a point. I don't know if I want to do that or if I want to round it out, but I will figure that out when I get to drafting. Okay, so let me neaten this up a bit. So this is how the mitten's gonna look. Come on. This is going to be 2 inches of ribbing. And then this distance here is going to be the wrist circumference. And then we are going to increase out, and these are going to be live stitches for the thumb that get put on waist yarn. And then we're going to keep knitting up for the hand. So this whole distance here is going to be hand circumference plus 30%. And then this distance here is also going to be 30% of hand circumference. And then we will knit up to the shaping on the top, and let me just drop the center line. We're going to short row in shape and then short row out shape. And that'll be live stitches. And then on the other side, this will be live stitches here. And this distance here up to the top of the fingers will be, no, sorry, it doesn't go all the way down here, it just goes down to here. So this distance here is going to be wrist to fingertips. Okay, there's a pattern. I need to do some swatching and some tests to make sure that this kind of thing is possible with Fair Isle over the top with short row shaping, which it should theoretically be possible on my machine. Like, I think the combination of buttons I need to do this will work. I just want to make sure that it's like reasonable to attempt it without causing problems. And then the only measurements I really need are wrist circumference, hand circumference, and the bottom of my hand to the tip of my fingers. So I'm going to do some testing to see if I like this approach, and if I do, I'll go forward with the drafting. Otherwise, I will go with this approach where they're shaped separately, and then I'll just have to like break the yarn and start on the other side. And then I'm going to translate all of this into code and come up with a pattern generator. I'm going to take all of these measurements of a hand and then add in my gauge measurements, and it will generate a specific pattern for a specific hand, for a specific yarn on a specific machine, and it should work for anybody. Yeah. Okay, there we go. See? Abstractions are easy. So I did some swatching, and it turns out that it is reasonable and possible to short row and Fair Isle at the same time. I wasn't going to do this if it was too much of a hassle because it's a lot of work. If it were a problem, it would have been a lot of work, but it looks like it's pretty easy to do. I do need to completely reset the needles every time I short row out, but that's not, I must hide. It's not too difficult to do. So this is the way I'm going to draft my final pattern. This is the way that a commercial sock toe is shaped on a circular knitting machine. They short row the toe and then you wind up grafting it to the rest of the sock above the toes instead of at the tip, the way that I do my socks. So yeah, I'm going to draft my pattern based on short rows at the fingertips. This is the editor for my website. It's called Glitch. It's just an easy way to get up and running with React style sites. That's why I use it. And here is my mitten pattern. Let me close this. And we have some copy pasted stuff that needs to go away. Go away, go away. Okay. Here is my mitten pattern. This is all input stuff. The only measurements we need are wrist circumference, hand circumference, wrist to fingertips, and then gauge information. And then we've got some utility functions, but instructions. So I have this reusable trapezoid abstraction, which I'm using for the wrist here because rectangles are also trapezoids. And I can just input the starting and ending information and it'll just automatically output the instructions that I want. So we have the wrist, and then we have the shaping for the thumb. Let me pull the thumb off, and then we have the shaping for the rest of it. And I had to do some extra math to get the short row information correct, but it should be good. I really need to build an abstraction for short rows, but it requires a little more thinking than I'm willing to do at this point in time. All right, I'm gonna go prototype this and make sure it makes sense. Let me put it on. I have my first prototype. It is mitten shaped. It does what it's supposed to do, but it is a little wonky. So the first thing, the thumb is too long. That's where the end of my actual thumb is. So I'm going to shorten that in the pattern. I also need to give the thumb a little more width. It's not quite big enough here. I think in the pattern I set it to about 1/3 of the hand circumference. I'm going to bump that up to 35%. And while it seemed like a good idea at the time to draft the pattern starting at the wrist circumference, it makes for a really wonky looking mitten. So the ribbing pulls in anyway. So I think I'm going to start the mitten at the hand circumference. Then the thumb will look a little less wonky and it'll still pull in and still be warm at the wrist because of the ribbing. Okay, I'm going to make those changes to my pattern on my website, and then I'm going to make another prototype on my bulky machine this time because that's closer to what the final mittens are going to be. Let's do this. Time to swap out the machines. Swapped! I made another prototype and it's not quite right because I didn't get the gauge quite right for the yarn, but it's enough to tell me that this plan will probably work. And it's enough for me to understand that I need to give more ease to the thumb because ferrule means like a layer and a half of knitting, and that means that the fabric is a lot bulkier, and I've also got a seam running up the thumb, so that takes some of the width. So I'm going to add more to the width of the thumb, but the length looks right and the length of the hand looks right. So I'm going to make those changes to the pattern, and then I'm going to make another prototype with my final yarn so that I know how it behaves when it's like a layer and a half the way that we have for Fair Isle. All right, let's do this. All right, I have my next prototype. And now the thumb is too big. But that's an easy fix. I'll just split the difference and it should be good. I think I'm ready to knit the actual mittens. I got measurements from my grandma. She is a tiny person, so her mittens will be significantly smaller than mine. But that'll do. I messed up the patterning down here. And then also here. But they're good mittens. They're good mittens. So I'm checking in at this midpoint because yesterday was really a struggle. I made the changes to my pattern that I wanted to make, and then I started making the final mitten. I even made an entire mitten, but kind of everything that could go wrong did go wrong. I had a bunch of issues with like my tension wires getting caught on my camera and losing focus, and then my patterning got messed up halfway through, so I was doing manual patterning on the turn over the fingertips, and then I got the whole thing done and I just don't like it. I just don't like this mitten. The thumb thing is too weird for me, so I'm gonna go back in the pattern and change that. Sometimes these things just happen. Sometimes it just doesn't work out, and sometimes it's just not what you want it to be, but I'm gonna take a step back and I'm gonna fix the problems that I found, and I'm gonna make a better version. And I'm gonna use a different camera setup because see this? The tension mast is right in the middle on my 270, and then my camera needs to also be filming like right in the middle, and with that arm situation, it gets caught up in the yarn, and that causes all kinds of problems and like loops on the end of my mittens. So we're switching to the real overhead camera, and I might even hook this camera up to it instead of my little one. So let's try this again. I'm casting onto waste yarn for 1x1 ribbing. This is my Brother 270 electronic bulky machine, and as you can see, I've ripped its guts out and replaced them with some custom hardware. I work with AYAB, an open source project to retrofit vintage knitting machines to be controlled by computer. I recently got the 270 working with the software, and it'll be out in the next release. If you want to know more or get involved with the project, there are links in the description. To knit the body of the hand, I'm transferring all the stitches to the main bed. I want to turn on end needle selection for a nicer seam, and I can do that by rotating these things on the bottom of the carriage. I love these little mechanical things. Now it's time to get set up for patterning. Carriage to KC, move it back to before the turn mark, load up the pattern in the software, the beeps means it's ready to knit, then the first row just does needle selection. Then we can hit the MC button and load in the second color. I need to increase for the thumb. This is a little tricky to do with Fair Isle. I need to reset the needles to normal working position, then do the increase, then reset the needles, remembering what was selected before I did the increase, and not forgetting that the end needle needs to be selected as well. One more time, reset, increase, reselect. And this continues until the palm is wide enough. The pattern will tell you when. Now it's time to take the thumb stitches off on waist yarn. I'm going to use a tapestry needle here to avoid disrupting the pre-selected needles. And the end beeps are a little delayed because I'm running the AYAB software in the background so I can have my pattern displayed on my screen. I'm tying off the waist yarn so these live stitches don't wander away. Then I'm taking them off the bed and securing the flap with a claw weight. Don't forget to reset the end needle. The same thing happens on the other side. Then we knit the rest of the hand. For the fingertips, half of the needles go into hold, and then we shape the other half with short rows. I'm wrapping the last needle selected, but only with the main yarn, not with the contrasting yarn. This will help prevent holes without making the turn too bulky. When short rowing back out, it's important to remember to reset the needles completely. Usually I just push them back in, but on a brother machine, if you're knitting Fair Isle and a needle is sticking out a little bit, it'll pick up the contrasting color, and that's not how I want my mittens to look. And you can't see most of this because my head is in the way. Point of view camera angles are really hard. This is the last of it, and I'm stopping my yarn in the middle and cutting a long tail so I can Kitchener stitch the seam. Then I'm taking the whole thing off on waist yarn. And there's most of a mitten. For the thumb, I'm covering the ribber so that my yarn doesn't get caught. Then I'm rehanging the live stitches, being careful not to twist them. Overlapping one stitch where the two halves meet to create a nicer seam later. Then hang some weights. Now I'm going to do some needle pre-selection so I can avoid that first row of plain knitting. I'm taking my best guess at what would be the row before the one that I'm about to load up in my software. then getting set back up for pattern knitting, this time starting with MC and 2 colors from the start. I'm cutting the contrasting yarn because I'm going to do that thing that we do with the crown of a hat to reduce the bulk. I'm transferring every other needle over one. Then putting the unused needles out of work. Turn the tension down to half of what it was and knit one more row. Then cut a long tail because this is going to be used to gather up the thumb and also sew the side seam. All of these stitches are coming off on a tapestry needle. I really struggle to do this left-handed. Then pull it off the machine. All the knitting is done. It's starting to look like a mitten. Cut away the waste yarn. Then gather up the tip of the thumb the same way you would a hat. Run a few stitches through the gathers. Then mattress stitch down the side seam. I'm doing this 1 row at a time instead of 2 because this is pretty bulky. And there's the thumb. Now I'm kitchen stitching the fingertips to the rest of the hand. Ta-da! Seamless. Then another mattress stitch for the other hand seam. I finished a whole mitten. And it's perfect, and it's lovely, and it's fine. And then I started the second mitten, and I got all the way to the end of the fingertips, and I managed to drop the whole thing off the bed. I think this project is cursed. I pulled out my white and my purple yarns, and I got ready to start adding waste yarn, and then I forgot to change the carriage back to normal knitting, and I pushed my hold needles back in so they were like sticking out, so they were meant to pick up the second color if it were Fair Isle knitting, and it just dropped all of the stitches off the bed, and I'm like, crap. So I had to put the whole thing down. I put the whole thing down with the intention that like I'd probably have to completely redo it, but then I got some lunch and things got better, and now I was able to save it with a lifeline. Some of these stitches are twisted, but I'll sort that out when I kitchen or stitch it closed. I still need to do the thumb as well. Sometimes projects are just cursed, but I'm gonna finish these mittens because they're for grandma. We have finally made it to the end of this project. I have 2 mittens. I was able to salvage the one that came off the machine early, and I didn't have to completely restart it. This was a cursed project. But I'm glad they're done. Grandma, don't lose these ones. If you lose them, I'm not making you another pair. That's not true. I'll probably make you another pair. It's just not going to be as fancy as these. The pattern for these is up on my website. There's nothing wrong with the pattern. I was just having a bad day. It should be fine. I'm glad I finished this project. It was a bit of a struggle, but I learned some things in the process, mostly short rowing for the fingertips, that I can short row and Fair Isle at the same time, and it looks pretty good. All right, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Happy knitting. How am I gonna photograph these? Cause like, okay, this is the mitten that fits me. This is the mitten that fits Grandma. She's a tiny person. I cannot put my hands in these to model them. I'll have to find another way. All right, I'll figure it out.